Could the awful events that cost so much loss of life and so much suffering at Mid Staffs Hospital prove a positive turning point for the NHS? Driven by targets, oblivious of failings in patient care, might the patient finally become the focus of Britain's National Health Service? Tonight, the Prime Minister has apologised to families who lost loved ones, but the inquiry into the Mid Staffs NHS Trust found failings at every level, which led to the premature deaths of hundreds of patients. The report calls for a new era in the NHS with a zero-tolerance approach to poor care. Our health and social care correspondent Victoria MacDonald has delved deeply into the issues.
Mid Staffordshire Hospital Trust is now a name synonymous with failure, abuse and neglect. But today, Robert Francis QC said that the patients treated there were failed by a system which was meant to protect them.
There was a lack of care, compassion, humanity and leadership. The most basic standards of care were not observed, and fundamental rights to dignity were not respected.
Between 2005 and 2009, hundreds more patients than would have normally been expected died at that trust. Relatives who tried to complain were not heard. Numerous warning signs were ignored. The culture focused on the business of the NHS and not the patients. Poor standards were tolerated. This report was always meant to be about how the failure happened, but at its heart still remains the patients. Like James Duff's wife, Doreen, who died there in 2008.
She'd go days without a bed being changed. A butter would be out of reach. We'd try to speak to the nurses to come and, would you come and help us with this, or could you help us with that? And they'd just ignore you and walk away.
The report does not name individual managers or staff, but instead blames a system that ignored warning signs and put corporate self-interest and finances ahead of patients and their safety. The roll call of dishonour is lengthy. Mr Francis criticises all the organisations responsible for overseeing the NHS, the Mid Staffordshire Trust Board, hospital staff, for keeping their heads down and not saying anything, the Primary Care Trust, the Strategic Health Authority, Monitor, which oversees foundation trusts, the Department of Health and the Healthcare Commission.
At every level, there was a failure to communicate known concerns adequately to others and to take sufficient action to protect patients' safety and well-being from the risks arising from those concerns. In short, the trust that the public should be able to place in the National Health Service was betrayed.
So here it is, 1, 2, 3 volumes of the Francis Inquiry report. There were 1 million pages of evidence, 250 witnesses, but what it all boiled down to was that there was a complete failure of the system. And today, Robert Francis himself has thrown down the gauntlet to ministers and MPs, saying that changes must be made to protect patients. Mr Francis makes 290 recommendations, including a statutory duty of candour. Staff must speak out when they see harm, and that it should be a criminal offence, he says, if they do not do this. He also said the Care Quality Commission should take over the role of regulating foundation trusts from Monitor. Mid Staffs had Julie Bailey and her campaign fighting to expose the lack of care, but there were 4 other trusts who had worse death rates, even at that time. And today there are still hospitals with excessive mortality figures. The Prime Minister led today on the report rather than the Health Secretary, and there was an apology and a promise to respond in full next month. He did announce a new Chief Inspector of Hospitals, and he said there were still some questions to be answered.
I believe the regulatory bodies in particular are going to have some difficult questions to answer. The Nursing and Midwifery Council and the General Medical Council need to explain why so far no one has been struck off. So the Secretary of State for Health has today invited them to explain what steps they'll take to strengthen their systems of accountability in the light of this report.
This is not enough for the relatives, though. They want heads to roll, specifically that of the now Chief Executive of the NHS, Sir David Nicholson.
I'm certainly not going to resign. I perfectly understand the upset and anger of Julie Bailey and the people in Cure the NHS. They've been through the most awful experience of healthcare. It's hard to imagine, isn't it, that you're not only did the NHS harm your loved ones, but also when you complained about it, they denied it had happened. That must have been an awful experience. But various bits of the system had the information in pockets and didn't share it across the system. That was a terrible and catastrophic thing to happen.
What this all came down to, the inquiry report says, though, is that the trust that the public should be able to place in the NHS was betrayed, and that those responsible for the health service must never let this happen again. It is now in their hands.